Okay, Rabbi, next caller on. Caller, please state your name and tell us where you're calling from.
Shalom, William. This is Gabriel Ben David. I've sent you a couple of messages.
Okay, very good. Shalom, Gabriel. Thank you for calling in. What is the question for Rabbi?
Okay. To dovetail what Rabbi has been talking about, and by the way, Rabbi, it is an honor and a pleasure to visit with you. I've Jeremy Gimpel and Ari Abramowitz, very dear friends of mine. I'm here in Amarillo, Texas, and I've known about you and followed you for many, many years. But my question is this: could Mark be presented as the Talmud is presented, first in Peshat, Matthew and Remez, Luke in Tosefta or
Jarash.
Jarash and John and Sod? Could it be that what we read in the Nazarene Codicil, or actually what we call the New Testament, has a message of returning to Judaism, but for some reason over the years this message was altered?
Okay. All right, let me answer his question. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Thank you for calling in. I appreciate it, Gabriel, and we'll get to your question. Thank you for calling.
It's very important to understand that Mark is not Pshat and Matthew is Jarash or anything like that. Now, Pshat means the plain meaning, Jarash means a homily or a deeper or more hidden meaning. None of that is going on. First, virtually, not all, but almost all the book of Mark is in the book of Matthew, almost word for word. It is true that Mark is written, his Greek is a little torturous at times, not as clean, and Mark and Luke, both who incorporate almost the whole book of Mark, will clean up Mark's Greek and his redundancies, his awkward idioms. That said, they are not a different type of literature, but rather they're seeking to improve the book of Mark. So it's very critical. Now, it is true, first, one point, that the authors of the Gospels believed that the Pharisaic teachings were directly from God, both the written and oral Torah, and that the Jews were the protectors of God's holy oracles. They never questioned that. Even Paul doesn't question that, and Paul is no friend. Paul in Romans chapter 3, verse 2, openly says that, makes that point. But it's very critical to understand that what Matthew is doing is he's looking at the book of Mark, which he had in front of him. He also had another source. How do we know that by the way, both Matthew and Luke had the book of Mark in front of them. Matthew and Luke are written about 15 years after, Matthew and Luke are written about 15 years after the book of Mark, and they have two sources in front of them. We know this. They had the book of Mark because they're copying Mark in most places word for word. In addition to that, there's less than 300 passages that we find word for word, or almost word for word, in Matthew and Luke, but we don't find it in the book of Mark, and that would be a Q source. So they had that. We no longer have this gospel Q. We don't have it. Only thing we have of it is what seeps through this 200 and some 50, 60 passages that are just present in Matthew and Luke. We don't have the original. It's gone. Will someone find it next week? Maybe. Who knows? But we don't have it. So that's what they're relying on. But they are improving Mark. They're not only improving the language, they're improving the stories, and there are parts of Mark that are highly deficient in their eyes. Moreover, Christianity was evolving, was becoming more elaborate. The idea that Jesus was, for example, born of a virgin was spreading, because it was common in the Greco-Roman world that the that the great gods, not the highest god, but the lower tier gods, like the the putative founder of Rome, Romulus, was born a virgin, Octavius, so on. They wanted Hercules, well, not Hercules, but they wanted their founders born from the upper gods. Hercules was said to have been born from a relationship between Zeus and a woman, not her husband. So this was common, so therefore they would want this, and this would grow, and therefore Matthew and Luke also not only improved Mark, where they felt it was deficient, but Christianity had grown, snowballed, it grew a long beard, and therefore they had to add to interpolate new stories that were developing. Matthew and Luke definitely, almost certainly, were not communicating with each other. We don't know who Matthew and Luke is. They certainly couldn't be on the phone or writing emails to each other, and I don't think that either of them knew how important their books would be, although Luke's introduction indicates that it was important to him to preserve what he believed were eyewitnesses, what he claims were eyewitnesses to the events. But I want to give you an example. So therefore, Matthew and Luke will have a virgin birth story of Jesus, okay, where Jesus is born in Bethlehem, to a virgin. None of that will be found in Mark, because in the time of Mark, people didn't believe that, or that was far from a consensus. But it had developed into a tradition that was widely accepted, and Matthew and Luke, therefore, using completely opposite, completely different plot devices, would create forged stories, having Jesus, who was known to be from Nazareth, but to be born in Bethlehem to a virgin. They're actually opposite stories, but they do get that across. They do have Jesus, who was a resident raised in Nazareth, born in Bethlehem to a woman named Mary, who was a virgin. That they agree on. They agree on nothing else. But we're going to go way off course. But I want to do I just want to give you one example of how Matthew, given that these are the texts you presented, Mark and Matthew, I'll give you an example of Mark and Matthew where Matthew improves Mark. Okay, so let me just do that so I can just show it to you very, very clearly. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at two passages. We're going to look at. I want to compare. Let's go to Mark, chapter 6, verse 52. Context. The story is Jesus has just performed the miracle, we are told, of multiplying the loaves and the fish, feeding thousands of them. Okay? What happens then is the disciples go out alone on a boat. Okay, Jesus is not there. What happens, it's the same story, but at the fourth watch, a storm breaks out and everybody's terrified, and Jesus then walks on water. There are some other variances which I'm not going to touch on because they're not germane to this point, but there's one really critical, and that is that Jesus then comes afterwards. They're on this boat alone, and the boat is tossing and turning, and Jesus then walks on water, and then the seas become calm. I want to focus on verse 52, and that is that once they had seen this, do you want to read for us verse 52?
For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their hearts were hardened.
So in Mark chapter 6, the disciples do not understand. And it says their heart was hardened because they did not understand the incident of the loaves. Okay? So Mark 6, verse 52, the disciples' hearts were hardened. Okay? I want to cross-reference the exact same story, but there's going to be a different spin on it, and I want you to look at Matthew chapter 14, verse 33. So I want to see what does Matthew do with Mark. He doesn't like that ending because Mark's presentation of Jesus is that really no one gets who Jesus is. Now, we know when reading the book of Mark who the narrator tells us from the beginning Jesus is the Son of God, but no one knows it. The one who gets it is Peter in Mark 8:30, in Mark 8:27, and certainly the centurion soldier, the Roman soldier, he at the cross gets it, the Son of God. But Mark, nobody really knows what's flying. The key point is, if we go to Matthew, all this stuff has to be cleaned up. This is highly unsatisfying. So if we go to Matthew, we have the exact same story. The disciples go out on the boat. The storm breaks out. The boat is thing. Everyone's afraid. Matthew adds in the Peter part, where Peter tries to do it, but that's not germane. The key point is this one passage where when finally Jesus calms the water, walks on water, and steps into the boat, the disciples, doesn't say they didn't understand because their hearts were hardened, but it's just the opposite. It says there, and they worship Jesus, saying, surely you are certainly the Son of God. You couldn't possibly have two conclusions that are more different than Mark chapter 6, verse 52, and Matthew chapter 14, verse 33. Here we have an improvement. Matthew looks at Mark and goes, es fehlt sich in Yiddish, which means this is not a very satisfying story. And therefore, and moreover, Matthew is not interested to the degree that Mark is in having Jesus having this secret, don't tell anyone who I am. If you figured out who I am, keep it a secret. Okay, that's not going to be as strong. Matthew also is going to be very interested in the primacy of Peter. So we're going to have Matthew 16, where Peter plays a more prominent, dominant role than we'll find in the same text in the book of Mark. And Peter and so on will have the story of Peter in the book of Matthew as well. So, and the Catholic Church will appeal to Matthew 16 in order to assert that Peter was in fact the first vicar, was in fact the first pope. So that's what Matthew is doing. There's nothing Jewish about this. These Gospels are written for the purpose, as the book of John says, all this was written so that you might believe. Period. And what we find in Matthew and Luke are improvements of Mark. Mark also doesn't have a resurrection account, meaning in Matthew, the book of Mark ends at Mark chapter 16, verse 8. The last 12 verses that are in your Christian Bible, most Christian Bibles will bracket them and tell you in the footnotes that actually the early manuscripts don't have this. Those last 12 verses of sightings and interactions and resurrection appearances was a later interpolation of scribes who clearly found Mark's ending, where the women, Mary, Salome, and so on, encounter the man who we are supposed to presume was an angel, informing them that Jesus rose from the dead. Go and tell the disciples. But he says they were afraid, and they said nothing to anyone. Bang, the book ends right there. Well, you can imagine that Matthew and Luke don't like that, and that ending is very unsatisfying to them, as it was to the scribe, who we don't know who it was, but somebody wrote those last 12 verses that appears in your Christian Bible today. They had to have an elaborate resurrection appearances. Luke is going to be different than Matthew because Luke is going to have the agenda of not having Jesus appear to the disciples in Galilee. So there's no Galilee go to the Galilee in Luke. In fact, Luke is the opposite. Luke's improvement is stay in Jerusalem, don't leave, because Luke has volume 2, known as the Acts of the Apostles. So there we have a variance. John is an improvement on all of them because John is unsatisfied with the adoptionism found in the book of Mark. He's unsatisfied with the notion that Jesus becomes the Son of God at his conception or birth, as we find clearly in Matthew and certainly expressed in Luke. He wants an incarnation theology, which means that Jesus started up here. He pre-existed his earthly ministry. He came into being in the eternal past somewhere. The prologue of John R, I should say, from the get-go, are possibly the most argued over passages in the entire New Testament by New Testament scholars. But there is no doubt that what we encounter in John's prologue, which means John chapter 1, verse 1 through 18, is what's called a higher Christology. In fact, I'll just say that's the highest Christology, which means John takes it a step much further and goes, this is not satisfying. I mean, Jesus just became the Son of God at his conception or at his birth. That was very attractive to the time when Matthew and Luke were written, 80, 85. But as time went on, that became unsatisfying. So the idea that Jesus was a logos, complicated word that actually is the source for that would almost certainly be Hellenistic Philo of Alexandria, not anything else. But the key clearly is John is presenting a much more exalted Jesus who begins his sonship before he comes to earth, and therefore John's direction is the following. Jesus starts off up here, which means he was with God in the eternal past, and then the incarnation means he comes down to earth to be among men, and so on. Okay, and then he'll resurrect. The adoptionism. So John is from up here and then coming down here to earth and continue. And what city he's born in, John could care less. In fact, in John chapter 7, we have very interesting dialogue, and there are a lot of big dialogues in the book of John. But in John, people are going, well, how could Jesus, who's from Nazareth, be the Messiah? The Messiah is supposed to be from Bethlehem. And the author does nothing to even correct that, because John is not interested. Mary, Jesus' mother, is never mentioned by name. She's mentioned as the mother, but never by name. He's not interested in Bethlehem. He's not interested in virgin birth. Who cares? He's from the eternal past. He's not God equal to the Father in the book of John in any way. Some Christians certainly make that case, but you have actually the most subordinate texts in the book of John in order to dissuade people from thinking that Jesus was absolutely equal with the Father. So the answer to your question, to give you the full-blown answer, is what is not pshat and medrash and not this and that? Yes, the early Christians all believed that both Jesus and, we'll go Paul, came from the Pharisaic world. And therefore, the Pharisees, in distinction to other Sadducees, other heretical sects, Pharisaic Judaism was correct in its belief. But now there's a new covenant, but the rabbis are never said to be conveying something that's false in doctrine. The Pharisees and scribes, as it says in Matthew 23, 1 and 2, the Pharisees and scribes sit in Moses' seat. And what does that mean? Whatever they do, you should do as they say. Do as they say, but don't do as they do, because they're hypocrites and vipers. But the information conveyed is from God. So Matthew, Luke, and John are all improvements on each other. Now, although the Christian canon in terms of Gospels ends there, this trajectory is going to continue. We're going to have later letters of Ignatius. We're going to have documents of the Gospel of Peter, 2nd century. We're going to have other documents that are going to come later that don't make it to the canon, where we're actually going to have it even more improvement and more improvement. So the trajectory is more, the Christology is higher and higher as distance moves further and further, and then the primitive Christianity that we would find in Mark is evaporating.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ועת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפץ הכל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפץ הכל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה בתפארה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפץ הכל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפץ הכל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפץ הכל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה בתפארה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפץ הכל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפץ הכל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה בתפארה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה והוא היה והוא הווה בתפארה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה